Thank you. I think Baroness Prashar would like to pick up this theme a bit.
Yes, indeed. Can I just come back to, I mean, you paint a picture that things were obviously getting better and there was meetings and so on, but successive witnesses have said to us that the military and the civilian departments, in particular DFID, failed to deliver what was required of them. And
well,
this was something...
As well.
Sorry?
I think I've said that as well.
Yes, indeed. Now, what was done to actually deal with that? Because in a way, the invasion itself was successful. You found the situation on the ground not as you anticipated. And the forces and the civilians there were doing their best. So they were looking for support from the centre.
Yeah.
So what mechanisms did you put in place to make sure that these got better? I mean, in terms of the relationships and so on. I mean, what steps did you take? I mean, meetings in one thing, but it's the practicality I'm interested in.
I played my part, but essentially the Prime Minister, recognising that there was a risk of what I think was described at one stage of strategic failure, ensured that there were the kinds of meetings that we've just been discussing where government was put on a war footing, although I think that's something of an exaggeration, frankly, but nevertheless there was a sense in which we had to solve this problem. Otherwise we risked wasting the progress that had been made hitherto. So, and he took a day-to-day interest in making sure that when people said that they were going to do something, it actually happened.
But let me just read to you what Keith McKigan, who is one of the officials with DFID, said, and I think it's a very interesting point. I'd like your observations on that. He said the organisational cultural differences between different departments make me wonder whether there isn't still a need for some kind of hybrid civil-military capacity in Whitehall, which we don't yet have.
I think that's not an unreasonable observation, and if I may, to some extent suggest a lesson that I certainly learned. One of the things that the military have rightly emphasised, and in the modern world the Ministry of Defence have rightly emphasised, is the importance of getting quickly into a situation. I gave the example of Sierra Leone over a weekend. One of the problems we face in a series of conflicts in the aftermath is getting civilian capability there in anything like the same timescale. If you think of Kosovo, essentially the administration conducted by Serbs who left. To some extent, Sunnis left the south and certainly abandoned their positions. Even if they didn't go north, they went home. So you've got a vacuum, not of a military kind, but of an administrative kind. And I think there's actually a role for some kind of what I would describe as civilian reservists, the counterparts of military reserves, people who they're not going to wear uniforms, but they're perhaps trained, give up a weekend or 2 weeks or something, so that their commitment would be that they would be ready to go into a situation as and when needed, so that they would be people who would expect to be called upon in precisely this kind of situation. Because the real problem is that I think all...
But that is something DFID could do.
Exactly. All departments for defence, in a sense, are used to the concept that you have got to get people quickly into a conflict, even if some of the countries that I can think of can't do it quite as well as we can. That is part of the modern thinking. But then there's a sort of gap, certainly that I've seen, where we're looking around for someone to fill that gap. Now, I've described the military reservists filling that gap in the south in Iraq, but that is not an ideal solution. You actually need civilian expertise who can stay and do some quite important but nevertheless civilian jobs.
But what about this cultural differences? Because I think part of the tension was military wanting sort of short impact projects, whereas DFID was looking at more sustainable projects.
I'm not sure I'd characterise it in that way, because actually the money that was being spent on quick impact projects was coming from DFID, as I recall. And what ultimately I was looking for was people from DFID on the ground, not only offering the money but helping to deliver it. The real distinction was not between the kinds of culture in the different departments. The real distinction was between what I would call short and long term. I think I've alluded already to the question of the power station. The real problem was that we could do so much on the ground with these kinds of projects. I mean, I went to see some of them: bridge building, sorting out actually footpaths, lighting for people in the dark, and so on. Very basic things that certainly helped smaller communities. But what we weren't sorting out were the big things, the big infrastructure projects. And I don't think that's a cultural difference. It was simply a question of getting these decisions taken and getting the money. And the money was supposed to come from ORHA.
Can I come? Sorry.
I'd like to pull a side thread on this, if I may, because we've heard from a number of GOCs for MND South East saying that looking to quick impact projects, they couldn't draw on much in the way of funding from UK resources, but that the American military had quite large stores which were under military control, and sometimes we managed to feed off those. But it was a different system. Comparative merits, I wonder.
No. Yeah, as I say, I think that quite a lot of the money did come from DFID, directly or indirectly, in the first place. There was certainly real frustration about some of these bigger projects as to where the money was going to come from, in the sense that the assumption was that it would come through ORHA. And
Congress had voted $18 billion US dollars.
Exactly. But getting it actually spent, getting hold of it, was just enormously difficult.
Can I come back to the impact of this on your own department, the MOD? Because given the fact you were there for a long haul, was there a corresponding uplift in effort and resources that you were allocating within the department, or was it business as usual for the MOD?
You mean in terms of the overall size of the budget?
Well, budget, but also the effort, but in terms of, how much effort in terms of people and in terms of support that you wanted to give. How did you manage the MOD? In terms of, did you raise your game to actually support the military long haul in?
Well, I think that is well understood in the Ministry of Defence. I mean, there is always a planning cycle when people are deployed that allows them to recuperate and to get back into their regular training, and that's part of the judgment that has to be made in relation to how long units can stay in a particular theatre. So I think that is probably better understood in the MOD than most places, simply because that's part of what they do on a pretty regular basis, and planning assumptions are made in terms of how long it is possible for different units to remain in a theatre. Nevertheless, it does have consequences, particularly, we discussed earlier, fire strike, anything that adds to that burden, if you're operating at or near full stretch, is then very difficult.